First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this presentation and then the discussions that hopefully that will come up after the presentation. All right, so the challenge was to talk about could we get into a climate neutral livestock production. So I'll try to convince you that that we can and how we can do it as well. But before we go to that, I just want to reinforce the idea that yes, we can do some sort of reducing the demand. This is a lot of time a question that comes in: why can't we just reduce the demand or get rid of livestock and then we solve the problem? I think the issue is a lot more complicated than that. We can do some reduction in demand in some areas, but we have to remember that animal source food is not just, we consume that not just for protein, although the amino acid profile of animal source foods are really exactly what we need for humans. A really important thing is that micronutrients are essential for health, and animal source foods are sometimes the only source of essential micronutrients such as vitamin B12, preformed vitamin A, heme, which is very important for the distribution of oxygen in the body, and vitamin D. It's also a major source of things like thiamine, riboflavin, vitamin B6, vitamin E, and also you will get a bioavailable form of zinc as well. So it is, you can to some extent be able to get some of this through fortification, but it's quite hard to get exact replacement by fortification, and a lot of places in the world you won't be able to get that as well. So when we talk about macronutrient deficiency, it's not just in low-income countries as well. I mean, looking at this data, according to NAIMS, the data, about more than 30% of women in the US had at least one macronutrient deficiency, with iron deficiency being the most common. So nutrient density is really important in all cases. I just show you this graph from FAO where there is a good correlation between the amount of consumption of animal source food and stunting. And stunting in children under 5 affects 1 in 4 children around the world. So it is really a serious problem, and it is a lifelong issue because because of the stunting, people will not be able to meet their potential. So in a lot of places where there is not enough consumption of animal source food, you see this issue as well. So it's really important to have this with us. And even in the US, this is from the recommendation, the dietary guidelines. And what this graph shows you is that on the right side, it's the percent of population that are consuming those nutrients above their requirement or the recommendation, while on the left side is below the requirement. So even for dairy, for example, it's over 80% of people in the United States, they underconsume according to the guidelines. So they actually do not meet their level of recommendation. What we consume too much of is sodium. Almost 90% of people overconsume sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. So that is really the problem we have. But in terms of dairy and even meat, there's more underconsumption than there is overconsumption. So I just want to put that into perspective when we talk about the environmental impact, because animal source food and livestock production is essential to our health, but it also has an environmental impact. So this graph illustrates what is the contribution of agriculture or livestock in general to the global warming, and what component of agriculture is contributing to the most to the environmental degradation or has an environmental impact. Here you will see that the majority of the environmental impact comes from ruminant enteric fermentation. So we'll talk about that in a little bit and see what it is. So about 33% is because of that enteric fermentation. And then we have a little bit from waste, either on pasture or manure management. That's basically manure that we keep it in a lagoon or other spaces. There's also emission that's coming from that. And then the rest comes from the energy that we use to grow crops and machinery and milking, cooling, and all that. And rice production is about 16%. This is globally. In the United States will be lower, but globally it's about 16% because paddy rice in particular produces methane and nitrous oxide. And then using fertilizers for soil fertilization also has an impact as well. So what about in the United States? Well, about 27% is coming from enteric fermentation. So that's from cows burping. Well, the technical term is eructating methane emissions. And then we have a little bit from manure management as well. So if you put manure management and enteric fermentation, livestock will contribute the most in terms of methane. And then we have some from natural systems as well. So why is it important, particularly in California, is because we do have a legislation on the books, the Senate Bill 1383, where we're required to reduce methane emissions or short-lived climate pollutants, of which methane is the major one, by 40% in the next 9 years. So we're thinking, okay, so how do we do that? What are the solutions to be able to get into this? So I'll talk about the main issue is the enteric fermentation. So the enteric fermentation is a feature of ruminants. So ruminants like cows and sheep and goats and the like, they have a unique ability to convert high fiber like cellulose into a high quality protein. And the way they do that is they work with thousands of different types of bacteria and fungi and protozoa to degrade this. And then the byproduct of that, particularly hydrogen and carbon dioxide, is used by a different type of microbes, the methanogenic archaea, that utilize hydrogen, and the byproduct of that is methane. So the methane is actually being produced by microbes in the cow's gut. Is kind of helps the cow to get rid of the hydrogen that's being produced because of the fermentation of high fiber. So the reason that we see cows consuming grass and other feed that we don't consume or we don't want to consume, all the byproducts, is because they're able to degrade it through the use of microbes. But unfortunately, methane is a byproduct. And if you look at methane in the carbon cycle, for the carbon that's been consumed by animals, is some of it goes into the building the body or producing milk, and some of it will be excreted as manure, and some of it will be converted into methane, and the methane goes into the atmosphere, and the methane lives in atmosphere for about 10 to 12 years. So an average of 12.4 to be exact, stays in the atmosphere, and then it degrades into carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide then comes back, taken up by the plant, taken up by the animal, and then you have the cycle continuing. So as long as you don't increase the amount of methane that's coming in, so you don't increase the amount of animals, it actually becomes sort of neutral in about 12 years. After 12 years, all the methane will be destroyed and comes back into carbon dioxide. So the cycle will continue. So the issue is, if you increase the number of animals, then you'll be adding methane into the atmosphere. Okay, so what can you do about it? So what are the mitigation strategies that we have to be able to reduce these emissions? So we have a direct method, and we have some indirect methods as well. And it spans from something that we directly affect the methanogenesis or the formation of methane in the rumen, to something that is indirectly affecting the environment in which the methanogens survive, and all the way going to looking at the sort of changing the microbiome and even breeding animals that are naturally low emitting animals as well. So they have a number of these things. So I will mention some of them, but unfortunately we don't have to go through, we don't have time to go through all of that. But I will mention the most important ones, and at least the ones that have the highest potential. So if we look at sort of the chemical composition of the diet in general, and how much we have how much concentrate we have, this is what we've been doing for the last well 50 years or so. So we made some analysis comparing what is the methane emission relative to how much milk we're producing in dairy cattle in 1964 compared to 2014. So the 1964 numbers are in the red bars, and the 2014 are in blue bars. And as you can see, that we reduced quite a bit in different categories. So this is the life cycle assessment. So we're looking at the whole life cycle. So for the animal to produce milk, there needs to be, they need to consume feed, and there's a feed production associated costs. Then farm management, which is basically looking after the animals, the machinery that's been used, and then we have enteric methane, that's belching out of methane, and then manure management, how we handle the manure as well. So in each of those categories, we see some reduction. For example, the carbon footprint, the whole carbon footprint of producing 1 kilogram of energy and protein corrected milk in California emitted 1.12 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2014 compared with 2.1 in 1964, which is a 45% reduction over the last 50 years. And similarly, we've seen a reduction in water footprints, 88% reduction. This is because we have improved feed production. So the improved crop genetics and management have contributed to large efficiencies in water utilization. And the land requirement for crop production were also reduced by 89% in 2014 compared to 1964. And this was mainly due to dramatic increases in crop yields in the last 50 years, and the great utilization of byproducts in diets, and reduced inputs such as fertilizer and pesticide use as well. So the land savings of the last 50 years are roughly the same size as the state of Connecticut. So we are producing more milk with less inputs. So we are using less land, less fertilizer, less water, and less energy to irrigate crops now compared to 50 years ago, and this trend is continuing as well. So just talking about California specifically, why did we see lower greenhouse gas emissions in California compared to other regions? It's mainly one of the reason is that California dairy farms typically use greater amount of byproducts compared with other regions. So we use almond hulls. If you go to the Central Valley, you will see mountains of almond hulls that used to be sent to a landfill. Now the dairies and beef cattle will consume it quite happily. Now we are working with others, other ingredients as well. So we're looking into olives and pistachio and tomato and all that. So they really recycle or upcycle a lot of the byproducts that we cannot use. So continuing with the mitigation strategies, adding some lipids and plant extracts in the diet also helps in reducing emissions. So when we simulate this, basically taking the diet, the typical diet in different regions around the world, and adding a little bit of lipid and improving the quality of grass being fed, we've quantified how much emissions we can reduce it by. Then in this case, you can see that in areas where you have high density of livestock, like India and China and Brazil, you see that the potential to reduce this is quite a bit. So by changing the diet a little bit, you can hugely reduce the methane emissions coming from the cows. Now let me go more into the direct inhibitors of methanogenesis. So this is something that you give to the animals and in a small quantity, and has a big effect. I'll start this with the seaweed, and I think you've heard this in the introduction earlier. So the story of the seaweed is that it started off by a farmer noticing some of his cattle doing better than others. They seem to be a bit calmer and seem to be doing better, and he contacted a scientist and basically seeing these animals that are sort of foraging on seaweed. This is in eastern Canada, so they have access to seaweed, and so the person, the scientist, then start looking into the seaweed, what is in it, and try to understand it. And then while he's doing that, he got a job in Australia, so he moved to Australia, and he continued to then look at the different types of seaweed in Australia, and they did some work in vitro. So they looked at different type of seaweed. In this case, we have a red seaweed, Asparagopsis, and a green seaweed, Erogonium. And when they incubated it in a test tube, and they added different doses. So on the x-axis, you see how much dose they are adding, and they looked at how much methane is being produced. So you can see that on the lower left panel, when they gave about 1%, the methane production was extremely low, and then over 2%, it was completely eliminated. So that happened with the red seaweed, but not with the green seaweed. Fortunately, the green seaweed did not show that the reduction was like 75%, which is, you can't, it's not practical. You're not going to feed 75% seaweed because, it's full of minerals and stuff. It's only have 50% organic matter. So that doesn't work. But Asparagopsis has a huge potential. So it's, even at 1%, it reduces quite a bit. And so when we saw these results, then we thought, well, I mean, there is a potential for this to be a solution, but a lot of times things have been done in vitro don't necessarily do well or translate exactly in vivo or in real animals. The reason is that when you do it in a lab, you can't really replicate exactly what's happening in the real animal. So we took a chance on this, and we started the first trial in dairy. We actually got some of the sesame seaweed from Australia, and here at UC Davis, we conducted this first trial. And to my surprise, big surprise, that it actually reduces emissions by 67%. So we didn't know how much we can give them, because nobody has done this before in cattle, so we had no idea. So I asked my graduate student, just start slow and we'll see that. So I remember getting a call from her and telling me the numbers, and I just couldn't believe it. So 67%, we've never seen anything like that before. It was really a big potential, and this was reported in a lot of places. And if you want to see how this works, and just to give you an idea of what we do, I have a little video here. So a number of videos that was shared, but this one I think captures this well. Let me try to play it.
It's breakfast time at this dairy farm at the University of California, Davis. But this
cattle feed contains an unusual ingredient, seaweed.
We mix it with molasses, so it's a nice little sweet treat for them. We try to mix it as well as we can into their feed, but we have some cows that'll pick it out, and we have some cows that'll go right for the seaweed.
If they don't eat the seaweed, then we won't see any reduction in methane.
UC Davis is testing whether seaweed can reduce emissions of methane, a potent greenhouse gas that's released when cattle burp, pass gas, or make manure. Dairy farms and other livestock operations are major sources of methane. That's why California is requiring them to cut emissions by 40% by 2030.
Reducing methane ultimately means reducing greenhouse gases and reducing the impacts of climate change. So it affects everybody in the globe.
This is a wild Atlantic kelp.
Before feeding seaweed to the cows, UC Davis researchers tested in this lab, where they can measure emissions in fermenters that simulate cattle stomachs.
And we can test the effect of different feed additives on the gut microbiology.
Here we have some milk samples.
They also test milk samples for flavor and nutritional value. The methane content of the cow's breath is measured when they stick their heads in these feeding machines. The first study of the seaweed diet only involved a dozen cows, but early results show promise and larger studies are planned.
And so far, it's very encouraging. We've seen over 30% of reduction in methane emissions.
Around the world, dairy scientists are looking for ways to reduce cattle emissions by spicing up their diet. They've tried garlic, oregano, cinnamon, and even curry, with mixed results. At the University of Wisconsin, researchers are studying how a cow's breed, as well as what and how much they eat, affects their emissions, which they measure with this treat dispensing device.
The machine draws air from the breath of the cow, and the machine continuously measures the concentrations of the methane in the air.
Really, what drives the emission from the cow is how much the cow eats. Because the more the cow is going to eat, the more she needs to process that feed, and the more methane she's going to produce.
Researchers hope seaweed and other food additives can help reduce emissions and make dairy farms more climate friendly. Terry Che, Associated Press, Davis, California.
Okay. Sorry, my dog is going a bit crazy. All right, so after that work had been done, there was some follow-up questions, and the follow-up questions was that although it's reducing emissions, what is the long-term effect? Would the animals be able to adapt to it? And what is the stability of the active ingredient as well? So the active ingredients in this case is bromoform, and for how long will it work? So we set out to answer those questions because it's a very valid question. We've seen it happen with other feed additives as well. And so what we did was we devised another experiment where we fed the animals for 21 weeks, so about 5 months. We fed them different levels. So the control, this is where we did not give any additive, and you can see that at the beginning there was high emissions and then it goes down. So the reason that it goes down is because we changed the diet. Cattle are usually fed 3 kind of different diets. At the beginning they're fed high forage diet, and then a transition diet, and then a feedlot diet, which is high in concentrate. And so this is exactly what we would expect. At high forage diet, there will be higher methane emissions, and then when you go to higher concentrate or higher grain, you reduce the emissions is reduced. So this is the control with no additive. And then when we added a 0.25%, which is about 1 to 2 ounces of this seaweed, we see a substantial reduction in emissions in all stages. And then when we went to the even higher at 0.5%, which is about 3 ounces or so of the seaweed, then we've seen anywhere between 60 to 80% reduction in emissions as well. So what we learned from this is that over this long period of time, there was no adaptation. It was working quite nicely at the beginning compared to the end, and then. Also the stability of the active ingredients also we were assured, because we were using seaweed that was collected 3 years prior. So we put it in a freezer. Well, the people who collected it put it in a freezer for 3 years, and we used that. And still, after 3 years, it was quite effective. And the other thing is, after this is finished, we tested the meat, and we didn't see any residue, and the taste was also there was no difference between the taste from the animals that were fed seaweed compared to those that were not fed seaweed. So the other good thing, I guess, is the similar work that was done in Australia has shown that there was quite a big reduction in there was a big effect on the average daily weight gain. So on the y-axis. On the left, you see average daily weight gain, and then on the right side is the feed conversion ratio. And this is for a control, no seaweed, and then a low seaweed, medium, and high. And you can see that on the mid and high, the animals were actually gaining more weight compared to the control. So not only did it reduce methane emissions, but it also helped in gaining more weight as well. Okay, so moving on to another potential solution, which is also an inhibitor. This is the 3-NOP or bovir, and this substance, it reduced emissions by up to 40%. So when we did a meta-analysis, which is a collection of a number of other studies, in this case, we were about 11 or so studies, and on average, it reduced emissions by about 40%. And this study has continued, and we now have about 20-25 studies, and it's holding quite well. So we expect by using this 3-NOP, we can reduce emissions by over 30%. So that's quite encouraging as well. And right now, this is with FDA. So I'm hoping that the regulation will come up soon, and if it approved, then we'll have something that we can use it right away. Another potential solution is Mutrol. Mutrol is based on garlic and citrus extracts. We did this work a couple of years ago, and we added about 15 grams per day, and we've seen about 23% reduction after 12 weeks. So for the first 10 weeks or so, there was a reduction, but it wasn't significant. But at the end, we saw quite a big significant reduction. So we are planning to do this. We were planning to this last year, but because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do it. But now, hopefully in the fall, we'll have a new trial where we have more animals to make sure that we have a more reliable result. So the only additive that is on the market right now is agalin, but agalin is sold for improving milk production, not for reducing methane. But there has been a few experiments conducted. This one is from UC Davis by my colleague, and by feeding agalin about 1 gram per day, there was a potential to reduce by 6%. In this case, the results were not significant. There was a numerical difference, but not a significant difference. And so maybe because the number of animals were restricted, when we're going to try to increase the number of animals and see if there is a significant difference or not. If this is by chance, then we will know. But we need to have more animals to see if agalin reduces enteric methane emissions as well as increase milk production. The one that's I'm really excited about and look forward to working with is using tannins and saponins. In California, we have a big wine industry, but the grapes, after you squeeze it for the juice, then what is left is usually sent to a landfill. So some of it is converted into just use as a fertilizer, but there's quite a lot that's not used. So we want to make use of that, not only as a byproduct to give nutrition, but as a way to reduce methane emissions as well. There was an experiment conducted in Australia that showed that you can reduce emissions by up to 20% by feeding grape pomace. So for us, particularly in California, where we have access to this, it would be a win-win situation where we'll be able to upcycle the grape pomace as well as reduce methane emissions. So we have planned to do work towards the end of the year or perhaps early next year. So looking forward to getting the results on this one. So the impact then is that the average net reduction rate that we could see about 80% in total. But if you just look at the total, the life cycle, the enteric methane emissions is about half or less than half of the total emissions within the dairy system. So for the whole dairy system, we can think that there will be a 32% reduction with seaweed, about 12% reduction for 3-NOP, and close to 4% for another additive that I did not discuss, which is nitrate. And if we quantify it, how much it's going to be, then the potential is that we can reduce up to 6 billion carbon equivalent with the first one should be seaweed, and 2 billion with 3-NOP, and 1 billion with nitrate. So these are quite substantial numbers. So if we're able to do that, we probably will be able to almost completely get rid of the ruminant enteric fermentation. So this graph that I showed you earlier at the beginning, we can have a big chunk of it. I mean, we have seen using seaweed up to 98% reduction in emissions. So once we figure out exactly how all this is working, we should be able to optimize it so that we can get maximum impact in terms of reduction. And quickly to then move on to another set of solutions. This is, in this case, is for manure management. So the manure management is about 9%. And we do have some solutions, particularly anaerobic digesters. And this is simply taking the manure into a digester. So it could be just covering the manure lagoon, or it's a structure where you can use the gas that's produced. So the biogas, about 60% of it is methane, and you can burn that methane and use it as a source of electricity. And what's left is a high quality fertilizer that can be used in crops, and the solids can be used as animal bedding, or you can use it as a fertilizer as well. There are other alternative manure management methods as well, solid separation, composting, all of that. There's a number of different technologies that are happening right now where it will help us reduce our emissions quite substantially. So looking at where it is, can we get to carbon or climate neutrality? Then if you reduce enteric quite a bit, and if you reduce manure even by half, then I think we are very much on our way to be able to do that. So in conclusion, there are several solutions that to mitigate enteric and manure emissions, and feed additives have been developed. Unfortunately, none of those feed additives that I talked about are on the market. So the issue is that they have to go through a regulatory procedure. Some of them will have to get approval to feed to animals. Some of them could be just as a generally regarded as safe, or it needs to go into an FDA approval process. And for effectiveness, the same thing as well. So I'm hoping that this process is not prolonged, but it really depends on the approval through FDA, how quickly we can get into the market. As I said, there are a number of plant secondary compounds like tannins and all that are still under investigation. And then the last point is that after all of this, we still need a protocol in order to be able to quantify how much carbon is reduced, and how much we can say that how much farmers could actually claim on reduction. So this needs to be part of the cap and trade system in California or worldwide, but this work has already started. We are working with the Climate Action Reserve to try to come up with a protocol, and so that once those feed additives are approved, then we can go right into protocol development and hopefully work with the regulatory bodies in the state to get those protocol approved, and farmers will be able to participate within the cap and trade system. Just finally, I'd like to acknowledge my students who have worked on this projects, and a number of institutions that have helped us in funding those kind of projects as well. So now I guess the favorite part is discussing and answering your questions.
Yes, thank you. Can you guys all hear me? Yep. All
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so we'll just go ahead, everyone. You guys can start putting in your questions into the Q&A chat at the bottom. I already see that we have a few already in here, so I guess I'll just start here at the top. One of the questions says, what led to the investigation of seaweed in the first place?
Yeah, so that's the one I mentioned earlier, where the farmer actually looking into the cows, and very observant farmer saying that the seaweed seems to have done well for the animals, and that led to contacting the scientists, and the scientists looking into different types of seaweed and in vitro, and then moving on into in vivo or with live animals.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Another question says here from Rob, it says, does feeding cows red seaweed work effectively over the long term, or do the cow's guts adapt and no longer produce the benefit from seaweed that is possible initially?
Yeah, so this is also the work that we've done very recently. And what we've done is we've given the animals the seaweed for 5 months continuously. So that would be enough time for the microbes to adapt. If there is any kind of adaptation happening, that is a long enough period for the microbes to adapt. So we did not see that. So we are okay. We don't see any adaptation happening because of that.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Another question from Kim here says, is silvopasture first grazing effective at reducing emissions?
So the silvipastoral systems will be effective in really sequestering carbon, right? So I think the main advantage of the silvipastoral systems is really drawing down carbon and keeping it in the roots and in the soil. So that's how they will reduce emissions.
Very interesting. Thank you. Another question here says, in addition to the FDA, does the USDA have a say in approving these additives?
I'm not 100% sure, but at least the USDA will probably be involved in making sure that those feed additives are safe to be consumed, and they need to be part of the approved list of ingredients that can be fed to the animals. So I think at that stage, definitely the USDA will be involved. But if you want to claim reduction of methane emissions, then it's regarded as a drug for reducing methane, so it has to go through FDA approval.
Great, thank you for that. Another question here from Marshall says, is the potential large harvesting of seaweed sustainable?
So what is happening right now is trying to figure out how to grow seaweed in a sustainable manner. There are at least 2 companies, one Blue Ocean Barnes and Symbrosia in the US, that are doing exactly this. So they're looking at aquaculture systems on how to sustainably scale up the production of the seaweed. Similarly, in Australia, there's another company that's also doing the same thing as well. So yes, I believe that it is possible to sustainably improve it. Yes.
That's great. Love to hear that. Another question here from Dave says, how does this fit into lab-grown meat?
It doesn't. The lab-grown meat is, it's a different way of processing. I mean, we are working with livestock right now. So yeah, I mean, there is no relation with it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's what I thought. Another question here says, would fresh seaweed be likely to have a greater impact on cattle methane emissions than frozen seaweed that was used in the current study?
Potentially. I think it just depends on the concentration of the active ingredients. So yes, fresh seaweed will probably have a greater amount of bromoform, or the active ingredient, because when you freeze it and keep it, you're going to lose some effectiveness for sure. So yes, it will do that, but practically it would be quite difficult to do that, because you really need to be close to the ocean to make it really a sustainable way. To be able to transport it, you really have to freeze dry it and keep it that way for transportation to greater distances. But yeah, I mean, in terms of effectiveness, you talked about the effectiveness. Yes, it will degrade in time. So 3 years was good, but if we were comparing to the first batch, So we got this seaweed was donated by CSIRO and Meat and Livestock Australia from Australia, and they did the work with freshly harvested ones. So when this same batch was used, they actually found like 98% reduction, and we're getting 80% reduction after 3 years. So yes, there is going to be that difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. Reminds me of like freezing kale when you lose a little bit of nutrients, like when you eat it again, same kind of concept. Another question here says, who is funding your research?
So the funding research is really from different sources. So for the seaweed, for example, it was all philanthropic sources. So the 11th Hour Project from Silicon Valley, and yeah, so it's a number of non-governmental agencies, and then the Foundation for Agricultural Research also was part of it. An organic farmer putting some funding into this as well. It's just a combination of different sources.
Makes sense. Another question here says, has there been any effort towards natural breeding to impact emissions?
Yes, there is some work that has been done on breedings. I've actually there's a very recent publication where what they've done is they looked at calves, and they looked at their emissions, and then when they kind of followed them on through the first year at least, they've seen this difference. Just because of their genetics, they've seen a difference in methane emissions as well. So breeding is going to be one way to reduce emissions as well.
Wow, that's very interesting. Another question here says, is investing in low emissions genetics for ruminants a reasonable strategy to achieve mitigation targets?
Yes, absolutely. I'm working with another genetics company. I actually have a talk coming up next month where we show that high efficiency animals require less feed, which means that you're saving emissions from the feed as well as from the animals as well. So instead of keeping animals for a long period of time, you can have it a little bit shorter, and you save from feed as well. So if you look at per unit of product produced per kilogram of milk or something, you would reduce the methane emissions. So that's definitely a viable way to reduce emissions.
Awesome, very interesting. Another question here says, is microbiology of methane reduction from seaweed understood?
We are trying to understand it right now. So we have taken a lot of samples from cows that was fed seaweed, and we are doing sequencing, try to understand what changed, what type of microbes, how it affects the microbial community. So that's being analyzed as we speak, and we're trying to get a handle of how it affects the rumen community.
Fascinating, thank you. Another question here says, when we buy eco-friendly products at retail stores, they usually are more expensive than non-eco alternative products. Will it cost dairy farmers more to buy feed or follow procedures that reduce methane production by their cows?
So at the moment, it would. I mean, if you only rely on changing diets, then yes, it would be more expensive because you have to buy more degradable feed stuff, which is then more expensive, or you add lipids and stuff, which is a little bit more expensive. And then when we go into feed additives, if the feed additive does not improve productivity, then it's an additional cost to the farmer as well. So that's probably why it would be a little bit more expensive as well. But with things like seaweed, where we see there is an advantage in increasing the average daily gait weight, then we might not have an added cost. That cost for seaweed might be offset by an improvement, or it might be offset by setting the carbon reduction to the state, do the offset protocol. If you do a combination of carbon offset and performance gains, then it might be you might get it for the same price. So we are doing that analysis as well. So we're working with the IFPRI, that's organization based in Washington, D.C., where we're doing some economics on what the price of carbon need to be in order the farmer to be incentivized and does not increase the cost to the consumer.
Yeah, that makes sense. You definitely need to incentivize to be able to have that happen. That's great. Very interesting. Another question here says, I think it was kind of along the lines of an earlier question, but I'll just say it again. Do we understand biochemistry of how seaweed works in reducing emissions that might lead to newer alternatives other than the ones you mentioned?
Oh yeah, I mean, not just seaweed, but we do know, we do understand the biochemistry of how methanogenesis works. And so the two inhibitors that we have now, the seaweed as well as the 3-NOP, is because of the understanding of the biochemistry that we were able to come up with solutions to sort of interfere with the enzymes that are required for the reactions to be completed. And that's how we were able to come up to that. But yeah, as more and more knowledge, we get more and more knowledge, then we'll be able to come up with other solutions as well. So there are other solutions that have been considered beyond what I discussed today.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Another question here says, is the necessary ingredients in seaweed known? If so, can fodder be genetically modified and grown containing the exact same active ingredient?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the active ingredient in seaweed, so the main one is bromoform, but it is a combination of other halogenated compounds. And we did consider this question, and the biochemistry of doing that is a little bit challenging, but we are working with colleagues to find a different pathway for a different compound, which is a little bit easier to integrate. So we're working with modifying alfalfa to be able to do that. So that's going to be 2-3 years down the line. But yes, at least the concept is we're working on it, but not specifically for bromoform, because it's not easy to synthesize bromoform within the plant cells.
Great, thank you. Another question here says, is seaweed a natural food for cows?
It depends where the cows are. Cows that live close to the coast, yes, they forage on it, and that's how this whole idea of using seaweed for reduction of emissions started, was from cows just foraging on seaweed. There's been a long tradition of sheep in particular foraging on seaweed in Scotland. So yeah, I mean, if they are around close by, they will do it, but it's not something that you normally feed. Because normally you feed things like alfalfa and corn and things like that. But
yeah,
if they happen to be close by, then they will eat it. Yes.
The coastal cows eat the seaweed. That's great. Another question here says, is anyone looking at the dried seaweed effectiveness?
So what we use is dried. So we actually freeze dry it to conserve the active ingredient. So yeah, we don't use fresh, we use dried seaweed.
That makes sense. Okay. Another question here says, are there biomarkers that can be used to quickly predict efficacy of nutritional additives so that more efficient screening can be conducted?
So far, not really. I think the issue is that the methanogenesis happens mostly in the rumen with the methanogens, the archaea. So I don't think there are any biomarkers that they can use to be able to do that. I mean, you can use to predict methane emissions. There are proxy biomarkers, particularly milk fatty acids. Certain type of milk fatty acids are you can use them as a proxy for how much methane emissions is expected.
Very interesting. Another question here says, regarding the idea of using grape pomace as another potential cattle food additive, would the cows be likely to encounter any toxicity from tannins and saponins?
I mean, there is an issue. If you put too much tannins, then it will bind nitrogen and so it would reduce the effectiveness. So I wouldn't say it's toxic, but basically it reduces your intake and it reduces the performance, which is not what you want. So it has to be at a level where it does not reduce performance, but it inhibits methane. So that's why we need to make sure that we are working in this area where we're giving adequate tannin, but not too much. Otherwise, it will bind protein, and so the animal will be deficient in protein.
It's finding that balance then is really the sweet spot, huh?
Yes.
Okay. That's great. Another question here says, could you please recap the relative impact of dairy consumption versus meat consumption that could impact emissions?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Relative impact of dairy consumption versus meat consumption. So in terms of environmental impact, so dairy is lower than meat, mainly because of the conversion efficiency. You would expect 25% of protein, for example, to be converted into milk, while in meat it will be lower than that. Maybe 15-20% will be converted into meat. So yeah, the environmental impact of meat production is greater than dairy production. But I think we also have to look at what do you get, what nutrient do you get. So it's not just about the protein, but you have to look at the micronutrients that you get from dairy and from meat as well. So I think that kind of nuanced analysis has to be done, because it's not really easy to just look at protein. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, protein is not the only thing that we get from animal source food. I think we really have to think about all the nutrients that we get from animal source food.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Another question here says, other than molasses, which you mentioned some cows rejected, are there any other ways to incentivize cows to accept seaweed and other possible food additives as part of their diet?
So the cows did not reject the molasses. I mean, the cows did not like when it's too much of seaweed, but the molasses actually, it helped us bind the seaweed with the feed so that they can consume it together. So I mean, this is a very good question in sort of how do you deliver it in a way that the animal does not really doesn't mind consuming it. So we started with molasses, but there could be other ways. You can't really pellet it because you need you have to go through a thermal process to do that, and you're going to lose a lot of the effectiveness of the additive as well. So for seaweed in particular, that's not a good way, but for others like Mutrol, for example, it's pelleted. So we pellet it and give it to the animals. So that works quite well with Mutrol. But with seaweed, you just have to be careful with the active ingredients. We don't want to lose the active ingredient by extra processing. So as little processing as possible. So the way we went around it is by giving them low enough that they did not notice. Mm-hmm. So I think the maximum level I would say is that about 0.5%, so 3 ounces or so is really the maximum level that you can give them. Anything above that, they start to taste it, and they might not like it. But then again, after a few weeks, they might get used to it. So it's just about how long do you wait for them to get used to it. But if you give them at low doses, if it is fresh and good quality, 0.2%. The one in Australia, they gave them a 0.2%. They didn't see any problems in eating them, and the effectiveness was over 90%.
Yeah, makes sense. Another question here says, do the carbon neutrality calculations from reducing emissions also account for the land and energy use in the corresponding animal farming?
So for this one, I did not include the land and energy use. I only looked at the effect of methane, and I think there's also here a nuance where we talk about carbon or climate. So the two are quite different. So when you talk about the carbon, so look at the carbon dioxide, the methane and nitrous oxide also emissions. quantity of those and to basically reduce the amount of carbon to zero. While climate neutrality is the effect on the climate. As I mentioned earlier, the effect on the climate is greater when methane is in the atmosphere, but it's only there for 12 years. After 12 years, it goes destroyed. So if we're able to reduce emissions by about 3% a year, we can actually get into a climate neutral because the effect of the methane is being reduced. The amount of methane is being reduced, and therefore the effect on warming, which is what we really are concerned about, the effect on warming then becomes lower.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Another question here from Robin says, is the fact that cows near the shore eating seaweed without any observable problems enough to suggest that it's safe to get FDA approval?
That's a very good question. Yes, I mean, that's definitely a good argument that seaweed is normally consumed and it's okay. But I guess it goes by species. So sort of you have to have a approval for specific species. So in this case, we're trying to get the grass approval for Asparagopsis in particular. But I don't expect there's going to be a problem, but it is something that we have to go through.
Yeah, formal process. That totally makes sense. Yeah. Another question here says, do you think that industrial farming practices will also need to be modified in addition to using these novel food additives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, I mean, there are different ways of doing that. And so, yeah, I mean, there are some farming practices that can be modified and help in reducing greenhouse emissions, particularly in manure management, for example. A lot of dairies use a flash dairy, and if you move from flash dairy to a scrape type of dairy in a more dry environment, you reduce methane emissions. So that's one of the strategies actually. It's been sort of supported now, and by changing that management system, you can reduce emissions, or installing this what's called weeping walls, and putting a screen to separate solids. So yeah, there's a number of farming management you can do to reduce emissions for sure.
Mm-hmm. I've been seeing this question a little bit, so I feel like I need to say it. It says, what do you think of people who are thriving on plant-based diets without any animal products?
Well, I think it's well, I'm not opposed to plant-based diet. I mean, if people are okay and they get their nutrients for plant-based diets, that's fine. But I have small kids. I would never give them only plant-based diets because I know that they are not nutritionally adequate. The nutritional adequacy is the most important thing. Yeah, you can fortify things, but I don't think it would be enough to do that. And also, I mean, we have to think about the whole world. In US and Europe, in high-income countries, you may be able to be plant-based and have fortification, and you can have pills and stuff like that to make sure that you have all the vitamins and stuff like that. But the rest of the world, they don't have access to all of that. As I mentioned earlier, 1 in 4 kids under the age of 5 are stunted because they don't have this micronutrient. So you can't really expect them to be. I mean, right now they are mostly plant-based.
Yeah.
One of the main reasons they are stunted is because they don't have access to high quality micronutrient source of food. They are mostly plant-based. So I think there's an argument, in high-income countries, you can supplement your plant-based diet so that you can get all the nutrition you need. But in a lot of places around the world, you can't.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you for clearing that up. Another question here says, do cows produce more methane when eating grass/hay or when being finished on grain?
If you are looking just methane production from animals, then there will be higher emissions from grass or hay because simply it has higher fiber content compared to grain. So that's why you see, that's why when I show you that graph, At the beginning, there was higher emissions because I was mostly grass and hay, and then it went down. That was mostly because of the grain. So that's very clear. But when you look at the whole life cycle, for grass or hay, the inputs into the system might be lower, and even they might even sequester carbon, so that it might even be negative. While for grains, you have to put, you have to use fertilizers and farming equipment and all that. So the inputs to grow the grain will be higher than grass. So if you look at the whole system, then grass might be lower than grain. If you just look at the grass versus grain, only that emission, then it's just because of the fiber content, the grass will be higher.
Very, very interesting. Coming up here on a few last questions, says, are there any naturally bromoform containing plants that might be easier to mass produce cheaply as compared to seaweed that could be integrated into cows' diets to reduce methane emissions?
I don't know of any, but if you know, I think there will be a lot of people that are interested to support this, and there'll be a lot of venture capitalists would be interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. One question here says, have you investigated the possibility of this strategy being accepted in countries such as India?
Yeah, actually, I was hoping to do some work in India. A couple of people from India visited me recently, and they do have a different species in India that's more common, and they also saw a reduction of 30%. I didn't have funding to be able to do an experiment. I would really like to do the experiment and verify what they say here at Davis, but I'm looking for funding. So if we get funding, then we'll definitely be able to do that. And yeah, there are a couple of species in India that some of my colleagues in India are telling me that reduces methane emissions.
Fantastic. Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Another question here says, will these additives work also with high grain feed that has become more prevalent in the past several decades?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it works better in high grain feed than it does with low grain feed. So like the feedlots where high grain feed, we've seen that's the highest we've seen. In our case, over 80%. In Australia, over 90%, up to 98% reduction was under feedlot conditions.
Very interesting. Question here says, you mentioned that we only need to reduce methane slightly to achieve zero warming. If we reduce methane more, wouldn't that be better, or is there no further reduction in warming?
Sorry, you mentioned only need to reduce methane. Yeah. So looking at just methane, yes. So if you reduce more methane, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to reduce as much methane as possible. I'm not happy to just reduce methane by 1 to 3%. No, we want to reduce it, by as much as possible. And that's why I'm really excited about seaweed. When I see the numbers like 80%, stuff like that, yes. I'm just talking about sort of the climate neutrality. To get to climate neutrality, where do we need to do that? So the 3% every year will help us to get there. But this is really here. I mean, rest of the world, like in India and China and other places, the number of livestock is increasing. So what I'm doing there, I have projects in Ethiopia, in Burkina Faso right now. What we're doing there is we want to improve the productivity of those animals so that we don't need to have too many animals. Yeah. So we try to keep the number of animals the same, but we want to increase their productivity. So that's how we're trying to combat the reduction of methane in areas where there is that room. While in the US, I think we have, in a lot of other high-income countries, we've done as much as we can, or we're still continuing to improve productivity, but the changes are very small, 1 or 2% every year, while in other places you can go like 10, 15% increases. So here we are mostly doing feed additives and directly attacking methane. In other places we are trying to improve the productivity of methane.
Very interesting. And I think we'll wrap up here. Kind of a funny one. I've noticed a few comments in our question chat box about disagreements with plant-based diets. Would you be open to debating with other scientists about plant-based diets?
Absolutely. I mean, this is what's it all about. I mean, we have to be able to have a discussion, a civil discussion on points that we disagree. I mean, I hope that, we have this discussion, and maybe we both will learn something from other people's perspective. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I've looked into this. I have some ideas, and then I'm very, very welcome to have this discussion.
It's always great to have an open mind, and I'm sure for the audience members that are wondering, I'm sure you can talk to him on Twitter, at him, and you guys can maybe start a civil discussion on there. That would be great. If you guys want to debate back and forth.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't say debate. I would say the discussion.
Discussion, correct. Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is a great time to wrap up here. So thank you everyone for tuning in this evening, and thank you, Ermias, for taking the time to speak with us tonight. I know for me personally, this topic was super interesting to learn about. And I know based on, I think we had close to 40 to 50 questions from our attendees. They must have found it fascinating as well. It is a hot topic right now. So thank you again. Audience members, our next Café Sci will be in July. So be on the lookout for the registration link in the follow-up email. And with that, I'll let you guys all go back and have a great rest of your Thursday evening. And I look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks.
Thank you very much.